This is the Nebraska Broadcasters Association History Project. It's a look at the people and the personalities who have made Nebraska radio and television what it is today. We're recording today at WOWT Channel 6 in Omaha. Thanks to Jeff Sabin for his help. For the NBA, I'm Neil Nelkin. Long career in Omaha radio means you work at many stations, some of them no longer around, some of them still operating. You've worked with or for some of the top and most interesting personalities who have worked in the Omaha metropolitan market over the years. Norm Roberts has been on the air in the Metro for nearly 50 years in one capacity or another. Beautiful music, what we used to call AOR, country, rock, news, talk radio, even a national network originating here in Omaha. He's finally retired so he can lead his life of leisure. We welcome to the NBA History Project, Norm Roberts. Norm?
Thank you, Neil. It's great to be here.
Thank you for your time. Been around a long time for a young fella.
I know. Yeah.
We might mention the beard because you play Santa Claus all around the Metro every December.
It started about 3-4 years ago. I happened to have the beard, and somebody said, "How'd you like to be Santa Claus for this project?" I don't have an outfit. We'll get you one. And it was a fun time. And I looked at on the internet to say, how much can you make doing this? And I thought, oh, this is something I could do. So I bought my own outfit, and every year it's gotten a little busier. And I'm really busy this year.
Well, we all need a little Santa Claus every year. You've been in radio since, what, 1972, kind of, when you started?
My first paid radio job.
And where was that?
That was actually in this building. My first paid job, I think, for $2 an hour, changing beautiful music tapes, the big 10-inch reels on an automation machine. You'd call it elevator music today, I guess. And we had to make sure that the music was playing, that the commercials were playing out of these things called carousels, which had maybe a couple of dozen carts with commercials, and hopefully they wouldn't jam up, and keep it on the air and making sure that everything's working fine.
And what station was that at the time?
It was called KFMX. Stereo. It had been top 40, Stereo 92, KFMX.
And was that originally WOW's FM?
FM, yes.
So WOW AM and FM and TV, WOW television, all out of this building.
This building right here.
And you were the keeper of the tapes.
Exactly.
How long did that last?
I did that for 3 years, almost to the day. Exactly. I think it was almost exactly to the day, 3 years here.
Who did you work with that was here in the building at that time people might recognize?
One of my bosses was Ray Olson, who had been, I grew up listening to on WW radio, and I think he had also been an NBC network announcer at one time. He would come in and like at 5 o'clock, he would record a newscast to run on the system. I remember him marking out the copy and complaining about the AP writing already at that time. Here's how we should have said it this way, but he was very, very meticulous, very relaxed, and that beautiful music format could not be tight, like top 40 radio. Everything had to have a second and a half in between. He was very like, all music, all the time. And then the next element would start, be it a commercial or back to the music. And Sandy Jackson was another guy I worked with here. He worked on WWAM at that time, I think doing middays. I grew up listening to Sandy on Coil back in the early 60s.
The original 1290 Coil.
Yes. And he was quite a character. He was just a nice guy, yeah.
And I believe he also worked with Todd Storrs at KOWH.
Yes. He was, if I remember right, he worked for Todd originally before he was lured away by Don Murden.
At Coil.
And I just thought of this now, but for some reason, one of their stunts, Sandy had to dye his hair green for St. Patrick's Day. His wife mentioned that in a story at some party at his house. I don't know why I just remembered that, but
Sandy Jackson also had a very popular teen nightclub here in town.
Sandy's Escape. And rock band I had back in the 60s, we played there one time, and And I remember him being in the back room, or back of the room, and I recognized the voice, and he's like, "You guys, you boys sound good, but you need more harmonies. You need more harmony vocals. You know, this single singers is good, but you can be a lot better." You know, in his voice anyway.
Was he right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Because we had a manager, and the first thing we did after that was learn the association song "Along Comes Mary," which had all kinds of stacked vocals, and it was a difficult song, but we nailed it after a while.
So you leave KFMX, this building. What's your next stop?
I went to, at the same time I was working at KVNO. At
The University of Nebraska
Station.
Omaha
Yes.
station.
And that I was doing a board op, so my first thing there was to run a UNO football game when they ran their game from Rosenblatt on a phone line. And then I ran
This would have been before Caniglia Field.
Caniglia Field was there, but they played some of their games at Rosenblatt back then for whatever reason. I don't know what it was.
Back when they had football.
Yes, when they had football. And then there were other, we call the board op, the person who sits and runs the controls. And among the things you ran was the classical programs. The announcing they didn't let us do. That was all done by either Fritz Lee or Paul Borghi, who was the general manager, to say, so we wouldn't mispronounce the classical composers' names, because the people would call up if it wasn't right.
They still do.
Oh, I
We
can
did one
imagine.
of these segments with Otis 12 a while back, who does mornings now at KVNO, and he's learned all of the names because of that very reason. Listeners know.
And a good friend of mine who's since passed, Terry Mason, he and I, when the station first signed on, we were always so tickled by the classical music because it was all this music we knew from cartoons, from Warner Brothers cartoons. Hey, that's the one where such and such happened here. And we both, I think, had very similar childhoods. So we knew a lot of this music because of Looney Tunes.
Now, it was classical during the day.
During the day.
Then what?
And then there might be like a news block, some sort of a news program. Usually those were on reel-to-reel tape. And then at 10 o'clock at night, they let us play album rock music till 2 a.m.
Of your choice.
It was all freeform, what you wanted to do. And so you had you worked one shift a week on that. And so there were basically 5 or 6 people who got to rotate to do that late night show. If you were the 8 o'clock board op, you got the show. And we had a great music library. It was fantastic.
Give me an idea what were maybe some of the top 4 or 5 bands or artists you played back then?
We played REO Speedwagon before anybody had heard of them. We did, I remember Elton John, there were things that we played by him that were not the normal things you'd ever hear on AM Top 40 radio at all. Oh gosh, there were so many to remember now. But we had fun.
This was back in the early 70s,
72 to 75 in that range, yeah.
Okay, now before we move on to your next stop, we were talking before the program about the blizzard of 75.
Oh. I was supposed to work at KVNO that day, which is, what was that, about 60th and Dodge. And I got into my car. I had a Volkswagen Beetle, and I lived here in the neighborhood, thinking I can just drive there. And I was stuck already because the snow was already over the bumper. So that, okay, I'll try to walk there somehow, because I did a lot of walking in those days.
You were young.
I got here in the building and walked in, and Sandy Jackson at that time.
Here in the WOWT building.
He said, "Good, you're here," and he put me to work, even though I wasn't supposed to be there. And so I worked, I guess, probably 3 to 10 or something like that with the beautiful music station. And then at 10 o'clock, went over across the street to Priscilla's bar that used to be there, and that's a whole nother story in itself. It was packed with Mutual of Omaha people who were staying at the Blackstone, which was still an operational hotel, and closed that up, brought some beer back to the building, if that's allowed to say now.
Sure.
Statute of limitations.
Exactly.
And I slept on the production room floor. Radio production was over that way. And then woke up at 6 and worked, I think, till noon. And then found my way, I think, partly walking down the middle of Dodge Street, because it was like Dr. Zhivago. where it was just, there were people walking in paths and the dots, and if somebody picked you up, great. And I got as far as UNO, and then I worked there, was on the air till 2, shut it down, slept on the floor again, signed it back on at 6 a.m. and worked till whatever it was. I think I spent 2 days there, so I was gone from home about 3 days. And this was not pleasant to be around, I don't think.
But radio people have to keep the stations on the air and functioning regardless of our personal inconvenience.
Exactly.
Now you're leaving KVNO. This is 75 or
75,
so.
and
You go back home.
I started working a couple weekends up in Fremont, where I grew up. And an opening full-time opening came up after I'd done some fair remotes from the Washington County Fair, and was calling in then. And then my mom made some fun of me a little bit because I didn't know what a heifer was, and but that's, and me walking around avoiding
Cow pies.
cow pies. But I got to meet the daytime people, because normally I just work weekends. So I met the daytime people, and they liked me, and they put me on 7 to midnight.
Now this was KHUB.
KHUB AM and
It had
FM.
already changed from KORN.
Yes, oh yeah. And it was kind of a adult contemporary, not quite top 40, but it was fun, and the equipment really was good there. After I was there not very long, then afternoon guy left, and suddenly I was working afternoon shift. And when you're doing that, maybe you're also being a courthouse reporter at the same time. I was the production director at the same time. And they talk about small town radio. You learn how to work, and you're the one that does it. And like you said, when the weather is bad, everybody's staying home. I got to go to work now.
Exactly. But that's what we like about it. That's what we do best. Who were some of the folks that were there? Who was the general manager, for instance, or the owner at KHUB?
Harry Snyder was the owner at that time. He later sold it while we were there, and I just had his name in my mind. I'll maybe think of it in a bit.
All right, bring it up
Bob
later.
Palmer was my program director, and Jim Snyder worked there later. Ron Ladd worked there. He was there, came back, and so forth.
He's now at ETV, is he not?
I think so, yes. Yeah. Who else would? It was hard. I don't know when we look at it now, was it that hard? But it was a lot of work, a lot of busy work, but it was fun, and we still had a choice to play what music we wanted to, and I ended up doing middays for a long time.
45s.
Too. We were playing carts.
Pretty progressive.
Yeah, when I got there, only the top 30 were on cart with a jingle on it, because we only had 3 cart machines. But then eventually, every month, my boss, would let me buy 100 more carts, because looking back now, they were pretty pricey.
At the time, they were.
And eventually, we had probably 1,000 carts in our gold library, and you had a wheel to follow, a current, a gold, whatever, but within that context, you played what you wanted and tried to make it sound right.
You're on the street doing news as well?
A little bit of that. Everybody did, yeah. Like when the hotel blew up in Fremont, Pathfinder.
Right.
Everybody was a news guy. I was supposed to be on the air at, was that midday or 3 that day? And I lived probably over a mile away from the station. I thought a Mack truck hit the front of my house. And later on,
It was a gas explosion, wasn't
yes. And I got a call, come in, the hotel exploded. Oh, okay. And everybody was a news person that day. And the days ahead and years, really, after a while. But that immediate part, everybody was assigned something, and we took calls. We were feeding all the major networks, international even, and that was something I'll never forget. You talk about where were you, and just seeing the things I saw that day were just something that will always stick with you.
A landmark event in the history of Fremont, Nebraska, for sure.
And still is.
You were there, and a lot of people, in addition to you, came out of that KHUB radio station, went on to be, semi-famous in the Omaha area. Any names you can
Kent
recall?
Pavelka was there before I was. His boss, Ken Hedrick had been there before.
Ken Hedrick of KFAB.
KFAB. There were other people too that can't
Was
think
Steve
of it.
Lundy there at one point when you were there?
He was a part-time, well, he wasn't even part-time initially. We ran a program for Midland College on tape. I think it was like every Wednesday at 6:45 or 6:30 with these college students, and I think he was one of those. Later on, he got to be a part-timer for us. So he was a kid we, let him hang out with us.
So you're responsible for giving him the career he has.
Sure, that's it. Yeah, that's
Sound
it.
good?
Yeah.
Steve Lundy, of course, of the Cat morning show here in Omaha, has done pretty well for himself.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. KOOO, back to Omaha. This is 1977.
Yes.
Now, this was the original KOOO. There's a KOOO here now, a different station,
Yes.
different owner.
This was owned by Max Sanders. He was a kind of a minor country star. He had a chain of stations, and like Wichita, I know he had. I don't remember where the others were right now.
What frequency was that?
That was 1420, and then 104.5. And I was hired to do overnights on the FM. Although my first shift ever there was on 1420, and I played Gene Shepard's "Blanket on the Ground." Oh yeah, I think.
Yes.
I think if anybody remembers, you remember
Us
that
old
song.
country jocks remember those songs.
And,
Yeah.
and we signed off at sunset. But 10 minutes before that, we always played the Daily Rosary on a tape. That was all. I'm sure it was a purchase thing, but
Right.
that was part of the sign off.
And then the Star Spangled Banner.
I don't. Probably.
Pretty much everybody did.
Probably, yeah. And that was country, pretty much standard country on both stations for a modern country at that time. We changed it after a while, we put in a lot of adult contemporary music,
Mixed in with the country?
and that upset the record labels because we were a major Billboard reporter, and they got, when you see yourself quoted in like Cashbox, I go, I didn't even talk to Cashbox, but Billboard, we were like one of the top 5 stations that kind of would rule what everybody else played, and it was weird to see the playlist I would make up. I'd do it over the phone, and the Billboard chart the next week looks like my playlist. They had the music director before me said they were one of the key stations in the country,
Reporting stations.
and I found that out.
Yeah.
And then
And down the road, Sweet 98 became one of those back in the day with R&R as
Yes,
a major
yes.
reporting station.
yes,
Radio and Records magazine, the late lamented R&R.
oh yes,
Then you moved over to the big dog,
yes.
KFAB, KGOR.
I got hired to do nights, 7 to midnight at KFAB, and part of that was when you come in at 3 o'clock, I guess it was, you did commercial production, and if you were a jock, you were a sports writer. And you're like, I don't know much about sports, I know the top 20, and Kent Pavelka said, well, you'll learn. And I learned, and they were very helpful too on that, but that was quite a complex at that time. And then after I'd been there about a month or so is when KEZO changed from beautiful music to album rock.
A lot of people don't recognize the fact that KEZO, which is more popularly known as Z92, the EZ stood for easy listening.
Easy does it. All music, all the time, stereo 92, like that. And it was very laid back, but they had great ratings, but the company decided to go a little different direction. And before they even changed, Ken Hedrick came in and said, starting Monday, you're doing afternoons on KGOR.
And what format?
On Top 40. It was Rock 100. And we did, the music was on reel-to-reel tape, not in the studio. So we had a studio, so they call it live assist. So you would, during the afternoons, the computer would send it to the studio. You do your blah, 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 blah. Here's the weather, talk about weather items you want to talk about that day. And then you'd hit a button and it would go back to the automation and play the next 3 songs usually, and then come back to you and you do the weather again. And it was a pretty nifty, slick format.
And you were live in the studio the whole
We
time.
were live, yes.
As opposed to voice tracking, which does something similar today.
Yes.
but not live in the studio.
And while the computer was running the automation out there, you'd be doing commercial production or maybe working on the Casey Kasem show. We were the station for that. We had to dub that from the disc, vinyl disc every week to reel, so it would play on the automation. And so you're multitasking all the time there. It was, you didn't have time to sit back on either station. It was busy, busy, busy.
The days that you were at KFAB, KGOR, things were a lot more strict in terms of making sure everything was done and done right.
Oh, yes. Logging, if we had to manually write times everything. If there was a 2-second discrepancy somewhere, Kent would say, what's this mean here? Because he would go through with a ruler line by line after you'd done the log, and everything, it had to be accounted for. Every second was accounted for. If for some reason you wrote down the wrong time, then you had to correct that. But it was a busy time. Back in those days, we ran a lot of commercials. We had sports, we had news on the bottom of the hour. We had NBC network things you either had to hit live or have it all time out to the newscast at 2 till the hour, as well as the bottom of the hour, going into network. And I remember the one day I went into my newscast earlier than I should have, and there was that panic, just the sheer panic of, what do I fill? I did the longest weathercast that day. And once again, it's going to be cloudy, and you read all the wind speeds, anything to fill it out till you get to the 10 seconds before the hour to do the live ID going into NBC News, because that was always going to be the same time. And working nights too. I remember Ken Hedrick saying, at KFAB, we don't treat nights, lightly at all here. We get into 33 states at night. And a lot of people used to live here. Maybe they're in California or somewhere else now. They'll listen to us at night. And our chief engineer, I remember him coming back the one time saying, yeah, I was listening to you in Washington State the other day. And so he was listening, so the signal got there at night. And so they were correct. Yeah, you don't know who's listening, but there was a lot more than you think.
Norm Roberts covers the nation. After KFAB, KGOR, it was 1290 Coil.
1290 Coil, yes. And at that time, Coil and KEFM were under, they called it an interim license. This was after Don Burden lost the licenses, and Nathan Novak, who was part of the Carr family here, had, I'm not sure how it all worked, some sort of a nonprofit license, and profits would go to Creighton. I don't know how
allegedly
that all worked out, but that was interesting to work on the station that I grew up listening to.
Was it the same station in terms of the on-air presentation?
It was probably not as hectic as the old. In the '60s, Top 40 was pretty not frantic, but it was
aggressive.
Yeah, and this was pretty, still pretty, very moving forward.
Promotion oriented.
The FM at that time, KEFM was country, and that was automated with Bob Kingsley doing the liners on that.
Who'd you work for at Coil at that time?
Jimmy O'Neill hired me.
The late host of ABC's Shindig.
Yes,
he did mornings.
Yes, and when I came, after I left KFAB, I was interviewing, and I had worked with Jimmy when I was at KFMX. He was the morning guy on WOW. And he says, there's a lot of people in this building who really like you, who really want you to come to work here, because they were people I had worked with in the past. And it was like, yeah, sure, this is great. And it was a good family. Larry Campbell was our general manager. Well, I just thought of that now. But Jimmy O'Neill was the program director and did mornings. And Steve Lundy was there at that time.
Was Terry Mason there as well?
He was doing, I think he was doing like 10 to 2 or so. And he was, and then when Terry started doing mornings later on, I thought, this is not the Terry I remember. He would never get up that early. But
yeah, he's left us way too soon. You also changed the tapes on KEFM, the country automation?
No, I didn't have to do that.
You didn't have to do that?
That was, I'm not sure who did that. I just did, back in those days I did news, so like I think it was about 7 till the hour, we did like a pretty long newscast on Coil. And then as soon as that got done, you flip the switch on the board, and then you were live on KEFM Country doing the news on that, a little shorter version of the same newscast you just did. So you took your pile of paper, flipped it over, and changed the call letters here.
You worked at the famous building, 90th and Dodge.
Oh, yes.
Tell us about that.
Oh, my, that was a palace. I know, from what I understand, that was the first building ever made to be a radio station, as opposed to where radio stations would move into existing buildings. When Don Burden built that, we had, the station was laid out so nice. The studios, each studio had the big glass in between, so you could look down, 5 studios down. The automation was on the far end, which, again, I didn't have to touch that at all. But everything was very functional. The Jock Lounge was across the way. And the story I heard when a friend of mine, Scott Young, was working at Coyle, Jerry West was the chief engineer, and he ran the building he was ran a very tight ship. You were not allowed, apparently, to smoke in the hallway. You could smoke in the studio and the Jock Lounge. And Scott said he had a lit cigarette in his pocket because Jerry was there to get back into the studio. But it was a great building. I think I have a key to the back door yet.
Let me ask you a question you don't have to answer, but there are rumors that that building at 90th and Dodge had microphones in every room, not broadcast mics.
Right. So I've heard that, and I've read that supposedly that when Don Burden had it, that he would, I don't know if he was taping or he listened, eavesdropped when things were going on live. You always in the Jock Lounge, you go, hello, you talk to the ceiling, but I can't confirm or deny.
Okay. It's good to hear. Yeah, good to know. After the news, KEFM and Coyle Radio, you moved to Council Bluffs Radio.
Just for a little while, yes. I was I was on the beach for a bit, and I was doing the thing where you're taking your resumes and tapes and not knowing what was going to be the next step. And 1560 had been split off from Sweet 98 because of the ownership rules at that time. And that was John Mitchell Jr. had that. And on the air was Tom Corator. And
who is still doing play-by-play in Omaha today.
And he says, how would you like to do afternoons? And he hired me on the spot. And
this is KLNG.
KLNG, yes.
Format?
Top 40. It was, they'd been top 40 with Sweet 98.
Originally
stations.
KRCB, AM and FM.
Yes. And so there was a lot of the carts were dated, and I worked in the Quonset hut over across the river at the transmitter, in the transmitter building. And it was dusty, but it was fun. You go to work wearing the worst clothes because you're going to get filthy working there. But it was fun. And we liked it.
Yeah. Speaking of those types of situations, you, if I remember, told me at one time that you actually had to go live from the Coyle transmitter site out at 60th and Harrison.
There was, again, this was under the Novak regime. I don't know if they were in arrears on rent payments to whoever owned the building at that time, but we basically got kicked out of the building and took everything out. We spent a month at the transmitter. And
that's not a big building.
No, it didn't have to worry about a heater there because it was all heated. I had a little newsroom. I had the workbench and I had a radio, and a few times we still had I'd sneak into the old building with my key in the morning and get all the wire copy and just roll it up and bring it back until I couldn't get back in there anymore. Then I had to buy a newspaper on the way to work and make the news that way.
Next stop is back in Omaha. You joined Mitchell Broadcasting, KQKQ.
Initially, I worked part-time weekend shift doing Top 40, and that was a lot of fun. I worked with Jim Snyder for the second time there.
And Steve Lundy?
And Steve Lundy. No, Lundy wasn't there yet.
He wasn't?
He wasn't there yet. It was still Mark Evans was the program director. And I did that for a couple months, and then one day I was taking a nap at home, and I get a call from Gene Taylor, who says, Steve Brown says I'm supposed to hire you.
Now, Gene Taylor was the news director at what was then 1180?
1180, yes.
KKAR.
1180 KKR, yes. And Gene there was a whole nother history there. He came out of Chicago and had been the general manager, program director at WLS. And as he had stories.
Yeah, my understanding is he was the program director there when they changed from farm to rock. The WLS used to be a farm station
That's
way
right,
back.
with the barn dance.
With the National Barn Dance. And Gene was the guy that flipped it to rock and roll.
Really? Yeah. Come here and I learned something new.
Exactly.
He hired me out of a nap. He said, State Brown says I'm supposed to hire you. And then I came, I think my first shift, I did an early morning, Saturday morning reading the news, and Gene was getting his car worked on that day, and he'd never heard me on the air. I had never submitted any application, anything to him, but just Brown told me to hire you. And he turned on he had his car worked on. He says, I thought I switched the station. I didn't know who this guy was here. Oh, then I realized, oh, it's the guy I just hired, but I'd never heard him before. And that was the beginning of a good run at Mitchell Radio then.
You mentioned Brown, Steve Brown. You worked for him at 1180. Was that your first encounter with Brown?
No, he was the creative director at Coil when I came there. So Steve would have a cigarette above this ear and a grease pencil in this ear. And he was always coming up with things. We had production studio A, and then there was production studio B, which stood for Brown. And if he was in there, nobody went in that room. And if he wanted to go in there, he just boot you out. That was his room. He did all kinds of creative production. When we moved to 30th, Coyle moved to 30th and Farnham, and then the new ownership was named. He was the general manager of Coyle. And so he went working there. I remember there was some kind of a chemical spill in southwest Omaha, and we were at the state fair or a game, and we were probably Waverly, and I hear this and turn on the radio, and Steve's on the air live, and we drove all the way from Waverly to downtown Omaha with him. He was on the air the whole time. As you know, Steve could just talk and talk and talk, and if there was a situation where traffic or what have you,
tornado coverage,
or something, he had a two-way in his car, and he'd buzz in, "This is Brown, put me on," and he would expound on what he had to say. And when President Reagan got shot, he took over that too. It was like, it's my newsroom, but he just sat down and said, I'm taking over now. Kind of like Alexander Haig. He did that to me.
You were on KCAR, you were a newsman, you were involved in commercials, you produced a lot of shows there too.
Including Steve Brown there. And Mike Boyle did his show, but Steve...
most people don't remember Mike Boyle had an afternoon talk show there.
Yes. I remember doing a promo bookends, the Simon and Garfunkel song, and how Steve here and Mike here. And
hard right, hard left?
Oh, yes. And Steve was something else in the studio, and when it was... you talk about it ain't brain surgery, but with Steve, it was brain surgery. In the studio, he was just ruthless, but you get him out of the room, and Steve was just completely different. He'd start telling these stories. He'd go, why don't you tell these stories on the air? And sometimes he would, occasionally, his Beach Boys stories and his Rolling Stones. And
tell me about the Beatles live on the radio.
I was producing,
which you would never have today.
I know, yeah. I was producing Steve's show, and I had the internet up here, and I'd be browsing around looking at things, and there was this guitar player's page, and somebody said, I heard a rumor that some radio station in Indianapolis once put a Beatles concert on the air live. I go, huh? And when we went to commercial break, I go to Steve, it says here, I heard a rumor about a Beatles concert on the air live. And Steve goes, and here's how we did it, in his voice. And he went on to how they used that. They had a phone line there. They broadcast the Beatles concert. In those days, I think they were about 35 minutes is all longer they played. And he also said that Don Burden's daughter bottled the water from the swimming pool at like the airport Indianapolis motel where they were staying, away out of the media, that Burden's daughter was selling this water that the Beatles swam in, And oh yeah,
Somebody somewhere still has some of that water,
Oh,
you can be
yes.
sure. And of course, there's the famous story of Brown being the guy that introduced the Beatles to the Beach Boys.
and he told that story on the air about going underneath from one hotel to the other. There must have been some underground passage and knocking on the door. And he had the Beach Boys with him, and
He was their road manager.
oh yes, and knocking on his. Then they talked whatever, and people asked me, "What do they talk about?" Oh, girls and cars, or girls and cars. To say it like
It's a
Steve.
good imitation.
And I remember the one time too, we were producing, doing Steve's show at 10th and Farnham, and there was this guy walking back and forth, kind of the old guy with a hat, and I was, what's he doing out there? And we got done with the show, and it was Mike Love from the Beach Boys, and then they went to lunch.
Of course.
I go, oh, well, that's who that was.
Yeah, he was actually their manager in Beverly Hills for quite a few years, working for Don Burton at the time. You were at the Mitchell stations when they were sold, and then you went on to network radio a couple of times.
Yes. First one was called Retro Rock Networks. I was still working for Mitchell then. I'm working just a weekend for Roger W. Morgan, again, back from Coil days. He had, I'm not sure how many stations were on the network, but it was a computer ran it, but the voice was all live on it. So you talked when the computer told you to talk, and to make sure it all timed out, because affiliates had to have, some of them had to have their news at the top of the hour. So that was, the worst part was, about 20 till you started timing out. Okay, I'll change this song here, and that was fun. That was early. I got stuck into the early morning shift, and then later on, after Mitchell sold to Wait Radio, then Wait bought
Radio One.
and then they moved back from Colorado to Omaha, and initially started working weekends on that. And
Wait Radio Network.
Radio Networks, doing the modern country format. And then a situation came up where there was too many affiliates for the country format for one person to do all the breaks. So I got hired to do middays on what we called it Country Red and Country Blue. I think I was Country Red. So then I only did modern country, and then the Blue did modern country and classic country, but not as many modern. And it was all this, the world of voice tracks now. We knocked out, 50, 60 voice tracks per hour.
For the individual stations.
Every station got a generic break that you sent everybody, and then those who contracted for a weather break, you're reading their live weather and temperature for them in Prescott, Arizona. And I know it's not Prescott, it's Prescott. And you follow
Alabama?
Oklahoma, which was the station there, was when Carrie Underwood was from that town, when she was on American Idol. And the guy, they were pretty active, and they go, we got a local girl who's we think is going to do pretty good on American Idol, so be aware of her. And she did pretty good for herself after that.
Turned out all right. And then after Wait Radio was sold to Dial Global and one thing after another, you moved on to Salem Radio when they came to Omaha.
Yes. Dial had pretty much moved everything, or was about to move everything to Denver. So I looked at it as an early buyout. And they took care of me pretty good on that. Gave me credit all the way back to my early Mitchell days for length of service. And Salem, I got hired to do, I was working part-time, dubbing commercials, reading spots. Initially, I worked almost part-time for a year, and I did the morning ministry show. And you're just telling what's coming up, all the breaks, and running the board for a talk show or two, and just little of this, little of that,
And Salem at the time had what, KCRO 660, KOTK 1420.
Which was Spanish religious at that time, I guess. I learned some Spanish, and that's a whole other story there too.
And KGBI FM, Big Stick, High Power.
And after I'd been there for about a year, they broke the hiring freeze, which all goes back to the big financial situation in '08, when the corporate-wide, they had hiring freeze, wage freeze, and they said I was the first person to break the freeze out of the company.
Congratulations.
And they put me on full-time, and I was still doing morning ministries on KCRO, and then I did middays on KGBI. Some of it was live, some was voice tracked, and I'd get to go home at 1 o'clock.
And then you move on and retire.
I retired, and now I'm Santa Claus.
Now you're Santa Claus. Let me ask you about one thing, go way back, because something else you brought up and had a photo with you.
Oh,
Back in the early days, something called the Wonder Bread family. There may, in fact, be people around who remember this. What was it?
the Wonder Bread family, as I recall, was, I don't remember, it was just a commercial or like a 5-minute piece. They would have a family in who, I guess, talked about how much Wonder Bread they ate, I suppose. And at that time, I was the 5th child out of 7. And our family, I have the photo, the still photo of when we must have been in this very room, and what they talked about, I'm not sure, probably all the, the Wonder Bread, and later on it's like, what? I could have had Twinkies and cupcakes and stuff.
For life.
Yeah. But my dad was funny because the picture I showed you does not have my dad in the photo. He was off on the side, I guess, to make the family look a little more photogenic, or look, here's a family in need, and so that was my first that was my first broadcast experience at age 1.
Age 1. Is that you were 1 in that photo?
Yeah, wow. I think, yeah.
Good looking boy.
Yeah.
Our thanks now to Norm Roberts for his perspectives and his history in Nebraska broadcasting. Thanks also to Jeff Sabin here at WOWT Channel 6. For the Nebraska Broadcasters Association, of course, Jim Timm, Executive Director, Marty Riemenschneider, Chairman Emeritus. And for the Nebraska Broadcasters Association History Project, I'm Neil Nelkin.